Coppicing was a technique where trees were cut close to the ground and then allowed to regrow from the stump. When you cut certain species like oak, ash, elm, or hornbeam at ground level, they don't die. Instead, they send up multiple new shoots from the stump, which is called a stool. These shoots grow faster than a tree grown from seed because they have an established root system. Medieval foresters divided woodlands into sections. A few trees in each section were allowed to grow tall for timber, while the rest were cut on a 4 to 30-year rotation cycle. Each year, a different section would be harvested. By the time they returned to the first section, the trees had completely regrown. A medieval English survey from 1135 recorded that Hayleywood contained 80 acres and that 11 acres of underwood could be sold every year, without causing waste or destruction. This wasn't just wishful thinking. Modern dendrochronology, which is the study of tree rings, can still detect the growth patterns of medieval coppicing in trees that are alive today. The system worked. Here's what makes this technique so brilliant. Coppicing greatly increases the amount of wood produced by a tree. A smaller area of coppiced woodland could fulfill demands that would otherwise require extensive clearing. It was renewable, sustainable, and efficient. So, why were people burning animal dung and digging up peat if this solution existed? Because the sustainable solution was controlled by those with power. By the 13th century, strict forest laws meant that even gathering fallen branches could result in punishment. Usage rights were limited and supervised. Coppicing required property rights, community coordination, and, most importantly, access to woodland. For the majority of peasants, the lord owned the forests. Coppicing was a privilege, not a right. The irony is painful. Medieval society had the knowledge and technology to manage forests sustainably, providing adequate fuel for everyone. But the social structure, where forests were owned by nobility for hunting and profit, meant that knowledge was never applied at the scale needed. So the peasant in his drafty cottage had no choice. He had to turn to alternatives that no one should ever have to burn. Section 3. Brown gold. The power of peat. When the forests failed, the first big alternative people turned to wasn't some new invention. It was the earth itself. They started burning the ground. They burned peat. To us, burning soil sounds crazy, but peat is something special. You find it in bogs and fens across northern Europe, especially in Ireland, Scotland, and the Netherlands. Peat is a dense, soggy layer of partially decayed plants that builds up over thousands of years. Think of it as a baby form of coal, and crucially, it burns. For a medieval villager in a windswept, treeless area, the local bog was their salvation. But harvesting this brown gold was backbreaking, seasonal work for the whole community. The harvest began in the spring. First, they would dig ditches to drain a section of the bog. Then, men would use a special long, narrow spade to cut bricks of wet peat from the ground. Imagine a group of men using a rhythmic motion, pulling these dripping, heavy bricks, each one about 90% water, out of the muck. But that was just the beginning. The wet peat bricks were laid out on a field to dry. After a few weeks, they were stacked into small pyramids to let the wind blow through them. It was a constant race against the weather. A summer downpour could ruin everything. The whole area would have had a distinct earthy, smoky smell. By autumn, the peat was light, hard, and ready. The size of your peat stack was a public declaration. We will survive the winter. Now, peat doesn't burn like wood. It rarely makes big flames. Instead, it's a slow, smoldering, sullen fire. This was its superpower. A peat fire could burn for an incredibly long time, releasing steady, radiant heat. You could bank it at night and easily revive it in the morning, which meant not waking up in a house of ice. However, this is where it gets interesting. Peat was far from perfect. The smoke was its biggest drawback. Peat smoke is thick, acrid, and pungent. It would fill the small, poorly ventilated houses, stinging the eyes and choking the lungs. Modern analysis shows this smoke is full of harmful compounds, so respiratory illness was likely common. But for the main purpose of not freezing to death, it was a price worth paying. That steady, smoky glow was the glow of life. Here's a fascinating detail from historical records. During the Dutch Golden Age in the 17th century, The Netherlands consumed approximately 16.75 gigajoules of peat per person per year. That's similar to dozens of poor countries today. Almost all the peat that existed in the Netherlands has been mined, with over 190,000 hectares stripped between 1300 and 1850. The scale of this operation was staggering. Section 4. The peasants' fuel: gorse, heather, and straw. Not everyone lived near a bog for peat or had animals for dung. In the uplands and along windswept coasts, people turned to the plants that thrived where trees could not: gorse, heather, and bracken. Gorse, also called furze, was an important fuel source across parts of medieval Europe. These shrub-like plants grew on open hills and pasture land with irregular branches covered in sharp needles. Harvesting them was miserable work. The needles had to be burned off before the wood could be used, and gathering enough for a winter was labor-intensive. But for the poor in areas like Scotland, Ireland, and coastal England, gorse was often all they had. The wood was small and twisted, but once dried, it burned reasonably well. It required constant attention. You couldn't simply load a fire with gorse and walk away, but it kept people alive. Straw and reeds were even more desperate measures because they burned very hot and very fast. They could only be used for specific purposes like baking, not for sustained heating. You would need an enormous quantity of straw to heat a home for even a single night. Yet, in agricultural areas after harvest, straw was abundant. Peasants would gather straw, dry it thoroughly, and compress it into tight bundles. These bundles could be fed into a fire to quickly boost heat for cooking or to supplement other, slower-burning fuels like peat. The use of these plant-based fuels reveals something important about medieval survival. People used everything. There was no such thing as waste. If it grew from the ground and contained carbon, someone somewhere figured out how to burn it. The landscape itself became a patchwork of microfuel economies. A village near a bog burned peat. A village on the moors burned heather. A coastal village burned driftwood and seaweed. Every community adapted to its specific environment, developing deep knowledge about local plants and their burning properties. Section 5. The impossible choice. Burning dung. If burning the ground seems desperate, the next fuel source takes us into territory that feels truly extreme. It was a resource produced every single day in any farming community: animal dung. For us, the idea is repulsive. But in a world where the alternative was freezing, what was disgusting became a secondary concern. Dried dung from herbivores like cows is just processed plant matter. Once it's dry, it's a compact block of combustible fuel. In many treeless parts of the world, it has been a primary fuel for millennia. For medieval Europe, it became a grim necessity. The process of preparing it is hard to imagine. The job of collecting fresh cow patties often fell to women and children. They would bring the wet dung back, mix it with straw or other fibers, form it into cakes, and plaster them onto an outside wall to dry in the sun and wind. A poor cottage might have its walls covered in these drying dung patties, the family's winter fuel curing in plain sight. Once dry, these dung cakes were surprisingly effective. They burned with a slow, steady heat. Much like peat, travelers from wood-rich regions often wrote with astonishment about people in wood-scarce areas using these unwholesome fuels to keep their homes remarkably warm. However, the reason this is so interesting is the profound dilemma it created. Dung wasn't just waste. It was the main fertilizer for the fields. Every basket of dung burned was a basket of nutrients not going back into the soil to grow next year's food. This created an impossible choice. Do you burn the dung to survive the winter cold, or do you save it for the fields to avoid starvation next summer? It was a terrible calculation. You had to decide whether to risk freezing now or starving later. It shows the incredible strain that fuel scarcity placed on every part of medieval life. Archaeological evidence confirms this dilemma was real. The presence of sparolites, microscopic markers of burned dung, have been found in hearth remains from sites across Europe dating back to the early Neolithic period. This wasn't a rare practice. It was widespread and lasted for thousands of years. Section 6. The charcoal secret. Concentrated heat. There was one fuel that stood between the peasants' desperate measures and the nobility's wasteful wood fires. It was charcoal, and it represents one of medieval Europe's most sophisticated energy technologies. It wasn't natural. It was manufactured. To make charcoal, medieval colliers would dig a pit and stack wood carefully, then cover it with dirt and set it smoldering. The critical part was preventing complete combustion. They wanted to drive off water and impurities while leaving behind nearly pure carbon. This process was an art form. A conical pile of wood billets would be built with a central shaft for smoke and an opening at the bottom for air. The pile was covered with turf and moistened clay. The firing began at the bottom and gradually spread outward and upward, controlled entirely by the collier's experience. One wrong move, too much oxygen, and the entire pile would burst into flames, wasting days of work. The result was incredible. Charcoal could reach energy densities of up to 29 megajoules per kilogram, nearly double that of regular wood or peat. More importantly, it burned hotter, hot enough to smelt iron, melt glass, and forge weapons. For a blacksmith or a wealthy household, charcoal was indispensable. But there was a cruel trade-off. Some of the wood's energy was lost in the conversion process, and it required significantly more labor to produce. A single charcoal maker working full-time could barely supply enough for a handful of forges. For the urban poor, charcoal was a godsend for another reason: transport. Because of its lower mass compared to wood for the same amount of heat, it was cheaper to transport to cities. A cart of charcoal could travel farther and produce more heat than the same cart loaded with logs. The production of charcoal in medieval Europe was so intense that archaeologists can still find hundreds of ancient charcoal kiln sites scattered across the low mountain ranges of Central Europe. Each site tells a story of a community desperately trying to concentrate and preserve their dwindling wood supply. Section 7. Bones and Fat. When nothing else remained. When even dung and peat ran out, medieval people turned to the most unexpected fuel sources imaginable. They burned bones. They burned animal fat. They burned anything that contained carbon and could combust. Let's start with bones. Research on Neanderthal and early human fire behavior shows that adding coal and bone to wood fires significantly reduces the amount of wood needed to maintain the same heat. Medieval people rediscovered this principle out of sheer necessity. Bones from butchered animals, especially large bones from cattle and pigs, could be dried and added to fires. They didn't burn like wood. Instead, they smoldered slowly, releasing heat over extended periods. The smell was distinctive and unpleasant, a mix of burnt protein and marrow. But for a family facing a frozen night, the smell was secondary to survival. But perhaps more important than bones was animal fat, or tallow. Tallow was rendered beef fat, and it was the cheapest fuel available in medieval times, a byproduct of food production. While we mostly associate tallow with candles and lighting, the poor used it as heating fuel, too. To use tallow, cloth or rushes would be soaked in the melted fat. These could be placed in a small dish or brazier and lit. The fat would melt, the cloth would act as a wick, and the result was a small, steady flame that could burn for hours. Here's what made this fascinating from a survival standpoint. Tallow was everywhere. Every time an animal was slaughtered for food, the fat was collected. Even the poorest family, if they had access to any meat, had access to some fat. In a world where every other fuel source was controlled by lords or required backbreaking labor to harvest, tallow represented a fuel of last resort that no one could take away. However, like everything in medieval survival, there was a cost. Fat that was burned for heat was fat that could not be eaten. And in winter, calories from fat were precious. Once again, medieval families had to calculate warmth now or food later. The ingenuity of these people finding ways to survive when every resource was controlled or scarce is honestly humbling. If you are finding value in this deep dive into medieval survival, I would really appreciate it if you could hit the like button. It helps others discover these forgotten stories of human resilience. Section 8. The foul black rock, coal. While peat and dung were fuels of the rural poor, another alternative began to pop up, especially in cities. This one was different. It was a hard, black rock dug from the earth that burned with a ferocious heat. This was coal, and its story marks the beginning of a new energy era with its own dark side. Coal wasn't a medieval discovery. The Romans had used it on a small scale. After they left, the knowledge was mostly lost. For centuries, people in coastal areas of northeast England would just find it washed up on the beaches, calling it sea coal. But as the wood crisis got worse in the 12th and 13th centuries, people looked at this black rock differently. Its chief advantage was its incredible energy density. A chunk of coal burned hotter and much longer than the same amount of wood. Blacksmiths and lime burners who needed intense, sustained heat for their work were the first to really embrace it. Slowly, its use moved from the forge into the home. But there was a lot of resistance. The reason? By all accounts, coal was disgusting. The smoke was a different beast entirely from wood or even peat. It was thick, yellow, and full of sulfur. The choking smell led many to associate its blackness and stench with the underworld. Plus, the typical medieval house with its central hearth and a simple hole in the roof for smoke was a disaster with coal. The heavy, sulfurous smoke would fill the room, blackening everything and making the air unbreathable. It wasn't until the later development of the wall-mounted fireplace with a proper chimney that burning coal indoors became remotely bearable. It's an irony of history. The cozy fireplace we love was partly an innovation to manage the foul smoke of this new, dirty fuel. But necessity won out. As cities like London grew, supplying them with firewood became a logistical nightmare. Coal mined in the north could be shipped down the coast relatively cheaply. This sea coal trade became the lifeline for the city's poor. They hated the smell, but it was affordable warmth. This led to one of the world's first urban air pollution crises. By the late 13th century, the smog from coal fires hung over London like a permanent, foul-smelling fog. In 1272, King Edward I actually issued a proclamation to ban the burning of sea coal in London because of the pollution. It was a complete failure. The economic logic of coal was too powerful. People would rather endure the smog than freeze. For a medieval family, it was just another desperate calculation in the unending math of survival. By the beginning of the 1600s, coal accounted for 3/4 of fuel consumption in London. The transition from wood to fossil fuels had begun, not because people wanted it, but because they had no other choice. So when we picture a medieval winter, we should probably change our cozy image of a roaring log fire. For a huge portion of the population, the reality was far grittier and smellier. It was the slow, smoldering glow of a peat fire, filling the room with an eye-watering haze. It was the surprising heat from a cake of dried dung, a fuel that represented a painful choice between warmth and food. And in the growing cities, it was the ferocious, sulfurous burn of sea coal, a fuel that warmed the body while choking the lungs. The story of medieval winter fuel is a story of scarcity and innovation. It reveals the immense pressures that shape daily life: deforestation, a rigid social system, and terrifying climate change. The smoke from these fires, of peat, of dung, of coal, was the smell of survival. It's a powerful reminder that throughout history, the line between life and death has often been as thin as the smoke rising from a winter chimney, no matter what was burning below. But perhaps the most haunting part of this story is this: medieval people had the knowledge to solve the fuel crisis sustainably through coppicing and proper forest management. The technology existed. The science was understood. What they lacked wasn't ingenuity or intelligence. What they lacked was a social system that would allow that knowledge to be used for everyone's benefit, not just the privileged few. In that sense, the medieval fuel crisis isn't just a story about the past. It's a warning about what happens when essential resources are controlled by a small group, when short-term profit is valued over long-term sustainability, and when those with knowledge are prevented from applying it. The smoke from those medieval fires has long since faded, but the lessons remain. For us, running out of firewood is a simple matter: a trip to the store, a quick call to the heating company, a minor inconvenience, really. But imagine if there were no store. What if the forest belonged to lords who would have you executed for taking even a single branch? What if your only options were to burn whatever you could find or watch your family freeze to death? This was the reality of medieval Europe during the Little Ice Age. Winters that stretched for 8 months, temperatures that plummeted to -30 degrees and stayed there. No coal deliveries, no gas lines, no backup plan whatsoever. Logically, entire populations should have perished. And yet they survived. Not just survived, but thrived.
How?
They discovered fuel sources so ingenious, so unexpected that some of them even powered entire civilizations. They transformed waste into warmth, garbage into gold, and desperation into innovation. And it's that lost knowledge of survival fuel that we're uncovering today. Section 1. The wood problem. Before we can delve into the weird alternatives, we have to understand just how essential wood was. It wasn't just a fuel. It was the foundation of civilization. People lived in wooden houses, ate from wooden bowls, and farmed with wooden plows. This massive demand meant that Europe's ancient forests were under constant pressure from the very beginning. By the 11th and 12th centuries, vast areas of forest had been cleared for agriculture to feed a rapidly growing population. This was the era of assarding, a practice where peasants would get permission to clear a patch of forest to create new farmland. It was a short-term victory, but it created a long-term crisis. As the forests disappeared, wood went from being a free, gather-it-yourself resource to a costly commodity. Then the social structure tightened its grip. The nobility and the church claimed the remaining forests as their private reserves. This is where we see the concept of the king's forest, which wasn't just a bunch of trees. It was a legal zone with special laws designed to protect game animals for the lord's hunt. For a peasant living nearby, it was infuriating. They could see the fuel that could save their family, but they were forbidden from touching it. And the forest laws were incredibly strict. In many places, you weren't even allowed to pick up fallen branches. This right, known as a stovers, was a privilege granted by a lord, not a given. If you were caught illegally gathering wood, the penalties were severe. You could be hit with crippling fines or face corporal punishment. While hanging was usually reserved for poaching the lord's deer, not for taking wood, the threat from the lord's armed foresters was very real. This scarcity was a crisis that was slowly building. But then the climate delivered a devastating blow. Starting around the 14th century, the world entered the Little Ice Age. Average temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened, and winters became brutal. The river temperatures in London began to freeze over, which led to the famous frost fairs being held on the ice. Alpine glaciers advanced, swallowing entire villages. The demand for fuel exploded just when its main source was more restricted than ever. A cartload of firewood in a city like London could cost more than a laborer's weekly wage. For a family in a drafty wattle and daub house, this was an impossible price to pay. They were trapped. Without a constant fire, the cold would kill them. So they had to find something else to burn. Section 2. The sustainable solution. What they couldn't access. Now, here's where the story gets truly frustrating. Medieval people weren't ignorant about forest management. In fact, they had developed one of the most sophisticated sustainable forestry systems in human history. It was called coppicing, and it could have solved the fuel crisis entirely. But there was a catch.